All right, Jen, if you don't mind jumping on video and audio. Hey,
Yeah.
um, where in the world are you calling from?
I'm calling from just outside of Boulder, Colorado, in a little town called Louisville. Not Louisville, just Louisville.
And when did you move there?
We moved here about 6 months ago. So still relatively new and enjoying seasons again after living in the Bay for many years where it's just the same all year round.
Although you do have 300 days of sun in Colorado,
Must
I
be
believe.
great.
Yeah, and a huge sky. All right, well, thank you so much for spending some time with me. Uh, to everybody who's here, thank you so much for joining. My name is Andrew Fair. I'm co-founder and CEO of Density. Um, but that's not interesting. Uh, Jen, who are you? What do you do? What is Range?
Yeah, so I'm Jen. I'm one of the co-founders of Range. Range is an async team communication tool. So helping teams share asynchronous check-ins, share meeting notes, build team culture asynchronously, all the ingredients that you need for a great hybrid or remote workplace.
So, practically speaking, if I'm a Range user, what am I
Mhm.
logging into, and what do I tend to use the product for?
Yeah, so you're logging into a web app. You might come to the product after seeing a notification in Slack or over email. And day to day, you are usually writing an asynchronous check in. So if you are sharing, like, here's what I'm planning to do today, here's what I did the last few days, answering a team building question, and you're sharing that out with your team and potentially with other teams. And the magic of Range is we do things like pull in integrations from other tools. So all your tasks from Asana or Jira or GitHub are there. We pull in kind of team building aspects. We help you connect with other teams that are working on similar items, all the kind of connections that don't happen with a normal status update.
So, as we were talking about this, and for the folks who have attended previous webinars, a lot of the conversations that we have orient around physical space, the built world, the workplace. One of the things that's really interesting about Jen and Jen's product is the workplace is kind of being redefined a bit as a result of the pandemic. And along with it, it seems that there are particularly important investments in culture. And so, Jen, I'm really curious, like, um, what does an asynchronous writing tool or asynchronous sort of update tool have to do with culture? And what are some of the things that you're learning about how teams operate with one another and in what is to be a relatively different working environment post-pandemic?
Yeah. It's funny because we often think of culture as like, cool, it's what happens at like a team happy hour. But I often think of culture as this kind of emergent property of all the ways that you interact habitually. And so together, those start to create your culture of what it looks like to have a team meeting, how decisions are made, how you interact. And in hybrid or remote cultures, a lot of those habitual interactions are going to be async. And so part of what you can do is then invest in what that async looks like. And that helps create more equitable environment for folks in the office and outside of the office, and generally improves how the teams work. So one of the things that happened last year was we, like many companies, onboarded a bunch of folks that we'd never met before. And as part of using Range, they answered different team questions about, where they went to college, their favorite classes, Halloween costumes, things that are seemingly pretty minor. But we've started to hear feedback from our team as well as companies that we work with that they've never felt closer to their teammates, even though they've never met them in person. And that I think is the power of what async can do, but we all kind of weren't aware of it necessarily pre-pandemic.
I mean, is distributed, I mean, is remote, I guess, like, can you replicate everything remotely? If what
Um,
you're saying is
yeah,
true, which is like, I feel this sense of closeness,
yeah.
like, how is it? Talk to me about your opinions on whether or not in person is really necessary anymore.
Yeah, so there's I think there's value in like face-to-face communication. And I don't think Range or anything of our investment in async and supporting that is opposed to that. In many ways, I think async is a helpful way to make the most of the time that you spend either in person or over video with other folks. And I think what instead is true is that we often rely on a Zoom call or an in-person meeting for everything. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like what we're used to. We grew up in the schools where that was all done in person. You know, your family talks to you. It's not like anyone's trying to do something wrong, but you don't necessarily need to spend 20 minutes in a meeting sharing a status update. That's probably better done written down so multiple people can get access to it so you can learn from that. And what that then allows is you to take those 20 minutes in the meeting and instead catch up and have a little bit of time of bonding. My hunch is that when it's safe, I think in person also adds a huge dimensionality to communication, right? You just get so much more, like you all can't see, I'm using my hands to speak, but they're off video right now. And a lot of that happens in person, just all these different ways. And so I think most companies will find different setups. And what we've heard from our customers or clients that we do research with is they are finding different ways to create a true hybrid environment where either parts of the year they all meet in person or parts of the week and get some of that value. And the asynchronous foundation just makes all of that work better. So everyone doesn't have to be there at the same time.
Do you have an office?
We don't currently. We did until end of April last year. We were actually in a interesting scenario where our lease was expiring right as the pandemic hit. And so we said, hey, we're going to not renew our lease until we can probably make use of that office.
Will you have an office?
We would probably have a co-working like space. Probably what we would align on, and this is what we've heard more and more companies talk about, is specific days of the week where folks are encouraged who are in a local area to come to an office, like Monday, Wednesday, or something of that nature. What we've heard is that if you don't align on specific days, everyone has this idea of like they go into the office and everyone's there. But if you don't do specific days, then no one's there. Like you come in and there are like two other people. And so actually the office dynamic that people are hoping to get, and this I think relates to like a lot of what you all work on and talk about, is kind of understanding those traffic behaviors as well.
So you made this comment that culture is what you make easy. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think historically people have talked about is like, oh, culture, you can't affect it. It's just this like thing that happens. And it's, you know, they're different across companies. It's neither good nor bad. And I just disagree with that. I think culture is very easy to impact. It's what you make easy for people on your team to do. So if it's easy for people to, you know, write meeting notes because you've given them a template, it's part of your meeting tool, it's kind of an established process, then folks are a lot more likely to do it. They're not going to do it every time. We're all humans, but it helps encourage that type of behavior. And then suddenly sharing out meeting notes and having an agenda is actually part of your company culture and what it's like to work there. And so that's where like HR and biz ops and technical operations teams really shine, is by investing in, let's make certain things easy. And that helps determine what our culture is going to be like a year from now.
How much of, so one of the interesting things that we've seen in physical space is that more and more of workplace decisions, space planning, space design, workplace experience is rolling into or adjacent to HR. Because, and HR or people as an org is often tasked with scaling culture, sort of like making sure that culture is well documented, you know, whether it's through handbooks or it's through process or policy or training or universities or one-on-ones or whatever it might be. I guess, like, in your opinion, is an organization either like interested and capable of changing their culture, or is culture like just this emergent property and it just is the humans that are in the room virtually or in person? Because I think like there are some organizations that are like willing to, it's like part of their culture to give a shit about culture. And so I guess my question is like, how much of that do you need in order to
do that?
Yeah.
I guess my like, I don't know, optimistic like do-gooder self is like, well, if we have a growth mindset, everyone can improve their culture. But I guess maybe to talk a little bit about some of the specific examples we've seen right now is a lot of senior leaders, sometimes the CEO, sometimes kind of more broadly than that, are much more interested in having everyone return to the office than the average teammate, because the average teammate may have moved during this time or is enjoying the flexibility of being partially at home due to family constraints or just not wanting to commute all the time. And that divide is actually pretty stark. And HR kind of sits between those where they're like, cool, both of these groups are our stakeholders. And so I think in some ways, what starts to happen is HR takes on this education role or responsibility of trying to help instill a growth mindset and the appetite for that in both leaders and the team, depending on what those dynamics are. So I think to some extent, you're right that it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, as if the culture is interested in culture, it proves that. But from what I've seen, there are step changes in how companies shift, and the pandemic has been one of those. So lots of people have woken up to the fact that culture is something they can impact and drive, and that it really determines how effective they can be as a company and fulfilling all their potential.
Well, it's also because like it also seems that like folks are using the term culture as a reason to justify physical space, which is like, oh, but like we need space and people to be in that space in order to have good culture, or in order to
Yeah.
propagate whatever it means to be a particular company.
And I would
For
consider it more of an ingredient. Like you have a lot of tools to create really wonderful culture that feels very close, and over
Mhm.
relying on physical space is just as detrimental as over relying on Zoom and being exhausted. Like neither of those things are great. Like the commute is also exhausting, and that impacts how people feel and show up to work. And so I think of it as a tool that you should use if you are able to do so, but shouldn't be the only tool in what you're trying to do.
Sure. So to folks listening, if you have questions, just as a reminder, feel free to toss them in the Q&A, and I'll make sure that I work them into the discussion. So don't hesitate. Um, the primary group of folks that you work with tend to be technology companies. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah. And typically we talk about them as like tech forward. They like
Okay.
technology, they like to use it. A lot of them are based in the Bay. But the vast majority either have distributed offices throughout the US or internationally as well.
Gotcha. So, uh, tech forward or tech oriented companies tend to have engineering teams that are kind of the seed of
Mhm.
asynchronous communication. Um, Sales, for instance, its primary function is not asynchronous communication; it's synchronous communication. But technology companies have this like, whether it's GitHub or READMEs or it's some of the type of like documentation is sort of like a part of, it has to be a part of the process.
Yeah.
So commenting code. I'm curious, like when you feel like you can make the jump from tech forward to all
Yeah.
other organizations, because like documentation is, I mean, writing is as close to the physical manifestation of thinking that we have, so it's like it seems like it would be such an obvious thing to be able to pull people out of meetings and give them higher quality consistent data where it's like one to many communication. How do you make that leap?
Yeah, I think
Or actually, I'm sorry, I realize I'm talking too much. Just to maybe a slight variation on this, how do folks who are trying to affect culture, who may not have native to their culture this interest in asynchronous communication, how do they introduce or bring that about in their company?
yeah. So one of my favorite things to talk with HR and operations team about is actually operating in the way that product dev teams do. And that's not to say that you all need to use GitHub, but rather that we can be iterative and experiment with policies and programs on a smaller basis. Historically, the way HR and operations teams has often worked is like, okay, this is our big goal for the next 6 months, and we're going to launch this new performance review product or program or whatever that looks like. But then what can happen is if it doesn't land well, you suddenly get that feedback after you've invested a lot of work, and you have to kind of go back to the drawing board. And what can happen and work really well with a new habit or any type of organizational change is starting with islands of success. And so actually having, for instance, a product dev team that's really good at async communication already, have them train up a sales team that's excited about it. So you've probably got multiple different teams, and there's going to be one that has a more of an appetite, or the leader is more interested in async communication, maybe because they themselves are remote or whatever the case may be. And starting with them and having them learn from quote unquote experts within your company shifts the burden from like HR and operations teams having to sell the whole value to actually different teams connecting, being like, oh, this is what we do and why it works so well. And that lands really naturally. And you get to learn all the best practices. And frankly, it helps distribute some of the work of advocacy and education. And then you can start to layer on the next level of skeptical teams until you've actually rolled that out across the company. I think the hardest thing there is you need senior leadership support in that, and that is a little bit harder to get if they are not aligned with that view. So I still think starting with a small team, building up a few more stakeholders who are excited about it can help in that process too.
That was my next question is if CEOs and executive teams tend to be the ones that are, most vocal about culture or being in person because of culture, how can an executive model the behavior they'd like to see or the tooling that they'd like to see? Like, what is asynchronous communication for a senior leader?
Oh, that's really interesting. Because I think a lot of the critique we've heard is like a senior leader in their palatial home in like Napa calling in and being like, work from home is great. Or like,
right, yeah.
I can't wait to be back to the office. Like my nanny is going to care for my children, and like folks
Right.
being like, cool, feel great about that.
There's a beach behind this wall. I just don't want to open it and make anyone feel bad, Right. Yeah.
So I think one is like executives just taking a moment and realizing that oftentimes the resources and privileges that they have are not what the rest of the team has access to, and then working with HR to think through how you support some of those. But the other aspect is adopting the habits that they want to see. So if they want meetings to be less a thing that the company is relying on, then they need to start to specifically shift habits to be asynchronous. So a good example of that is even just sending an email saying like, hey, instead of having a meeting on this, I wanted to start a discussion asynchronously. Here are 3 points, and like the relevant docs, like always share context as much as possible so folks can be up to speed. And then like sign off with like, if we still need a meeting about this after we discuss async, let's do it. But trying to experiment with this. And that starts to role model kind of, oh, this is possible. And trust me, the first few times that you do it, people are going to be like, let's just have a meeting. And you kind of got to like stick with it and be like, actually, I got the information that I need. So cool, we're good. Thanks for this thread. And that starts to get people the aha moment of like, oh, I didn't have to sit for 30 minutes and talk through this.
It's interesting, like getting people to realize the benefit of asynchronous communication is almost like measuring the absence of something.
I can tell you as a company who's founded on that, it's difficult.
Like the ROI is no more meetings, or fewer meetings. It's like, how do you measure that return? One other thing, that I'm maybe curious about, and actually, before I jump into, so for attendees, we're going to go until the 30 on sort of broader sort of cultural conversation. At the 30, we are going to shift into note-taking nerd questions. Like, I have a bunch of questions that are just specifically associated with the weird and quirky world of note-taking. And so I just want to, you can drop off if that's not interesting to you all. And Jen, if you don't mind humoring me. Okay, cool. So there's a question from someone, good question about your piece in CMS Wire back in March about workplace mental health. First off, thank you for writing it with an exclamation point, but also the question was, without violating any confidences, can you share a story where your team has navigated a case that got someone the self-care that they needed while still being a productive member of the team? I don't have as much of the context, so perhaps this is clear to you.
I can share a little bit of background. Okay. So I think everyone is probably aware, has experienced it, that the pandemic has not been great for mental health, and that aspect of the pandemic also isn't solved with a vaccine. So it's just kind of mental health doesn't just bounce back. It often lasts for the struggles can last for many years. And a lot of HR teams are investing in additional resources, like companies like I think Spring Health and Ginger, and getting people access to more therapy. But often it also lands on managers where you have a 6-7 person team and 3 of them are struggling with mental health, 1 severely so. And we often feel this burden as a manager or as a leader to say, okay, I'm going to take on their work, I'm going to support that person. And a lot of what this article is about, and it's in CMS Wire, I'm sure you can Google, it is about how you have hard conversations and how you draw boundaries and how you help support someone through something like that while not burning yourself out. And I think some examples of this, so earlier this year, we had a conversation with our team. So at the end of the year, COVID rates were spiking. There was a lot of political unrest and unclear kind of path for vaccination. So we were all feeling pretty rough about things. And what we had with a conversation with our team was, hey, everyone is going to check in with their manager about what they might need right now. And we are not going to be prescriptive about exactly what that looks like for different people, but we are encouraging things like coaching, therapy, taking time off, going part-time if you need to. And we're trying to be more clear about what options are. And from that, a few different folks emerged with, and this is an overly pedantic way to describe it, but like treatment plans for themselves of like, hey, for me, I really need to take time off and I need to see friends. So I'm going to really try to do that. Or for me, I just need a few weeks where I work 4 days to help get my family situation figured out. Or for me, I need to stop working evenings as much as a founder, things like that. And that really helped, I think, in 2 ways. One, talking about it openly and coming up with putting the onus on the individual to come up with their tactics helped create a conversation around emotional fitness at work, and then allowed us to check back in, right? So if someone's strategies aren't working, then you can talk through that. And it's not always the burden of the company to solve all of those things. Unfortunately, we aren't in a country where there's as many government-funded mental health resources, and so a lot of that lands on the company. But it's also okay if the treatment and conversation doesn't work, and to have that conversation about how someone's showing up at work. And I think that's the hardest one. So I wouldn't say it's always rosy where it always works.
Cool. I noticed that you take notes by hand.
I do.
And you are the co-founder of a note-taking application, a web application. So tell me, reconcile those two things for me.
Yeah. So for me, note-taking is a learning aspect. It's how I process information. So if I do not take notes on a conversation, my memory of it is very fuzzy. So the way I often take notes is a measure of like my participation in a conversation of like, oh, you said this word, that word. It's rarely legible afterwards in terms of being used for others. And so for me, writing notes physically is a way that I learn, whereas writing notes for consumption and documentation and sharing of context and information is a very different activity and often involves like a summarization or a step after reviewing my very scrambled written notes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so one of the things that's interesting is that not all note-taking is of the same quality.
Yeah.
So one person who's capable of really concise, great brevity, like understands how to maybe create a bit of a narrative inside of either a longer document or,
yeah.
I mean, there are things that make writing objectively better. One piece of writing objectively better than other writing, and so I'm curious, like, you're sort of asking a lot of folks, and like, one, start writing, two, start writing asynchronously instead of reaching for the easy, blunt instrument of a meeting, and three, write well, right? And maybe the write well comes later, but if you don't write well early, it's hard to get folks who are the readers or the audience to like be comfortable and excited about adopting it because it's not super compelling. So curious how you deal with, those headwinds.
Yeah, so I think like one of the biggest things here is that having a blank page or a blank text box on Slack does you no favors in terms of figuring out what to write and how to communicate it with others. So a lot of what the value of range is adding structure, which both makes it easier for people to communicate well. So when you have like 3 questions to answer, like what is your top priority for today? What was the biggest thing you got done yesterday? that's a lot easier than here's a open blocks of like status update. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, it's a conversation, I can answer that question. And from a technology aspect, it also makes it much easier to summarize and share that information out 3 months later to say like, cool, here were the top 3 things from that month, because this person mentioned it 14 times as their top thing. And so you can actually summarize that information a lot better, where it's very difficult to summarize open-ended text. And I think in general, that holds true outside of range as well, and is why you see a big investment from larger HR teams like the one at Twitter or elsewhere in templates and saying like, here's how to write a project update, or here's how to write a summary from a meeting. And that helps to kind of level the playing field for different folks. But I think it's also okay to say some people are better at writing meeting notes or at facilitating a meeting or at doing this and investing in that. I often think about it as, we think of like the leader as like one person, one role, and really folks can lead in lots of different ways. And actually the premise of range is empowering that. So a lot of tools, like even wonderful like workplace tools like Lattice or 15.5, are very much focused on individual report to manager, manager report to next manager, share that information out. A lot of what is powerful about async and hybrid communication is the empowerment aspect of someone else can write the meeting notes, and there's power and authority in writing the meeting notes and in sharing the story. And so you actually start to distribute that, which changes a lot of the dynamics of how the team works.
Tell me about search. I mean,
Yeah.
writing it down is one thing. Finding it 6 months later is a whole other ball game. So how do you make this stuff recur, you know?
Does anyone else take Google Drive and searching that for anything?
Yeah. Oh my God.
Remarkable that they're
It's like Slack search is trying to make you frustrated. It's like it's like its sole job is to like make no sense.
To give you something you were not looking for.
Yes, from
Yeah, so
2016, you know,
a
because it's
lot of
most
what
relevant.
here, part of that is that structure. So when you can say, so like for range, for instance, we use hashtags. You can hashtag different items that you share, just like you would on Twitter. And that makes search a lot easier because you can search a topic and pull up information. Because we also have pull in a lot of integrations, you can actually search across products. You can search across Asana, something from GitHub that you might have pulled in, if as long as it has that word. And so I think that's part of it. And so like doing that little bit of structuring of your writing or meeting notes ahead of time makes looking back a lot easier. I would say from a meeting notes perspective, one of our biggest things that we're working to compete better with is Google Docs search, because you can just have a long doc and you can just search for a word and start to like look through things. And so I think actually one of the biggest things is having a common language about work. Because if you're all searching for different terms for the same topic, then it's really hard to find the right thing that you were talking about. So things like naming of documents, naming of folders, using common language, like that actually starts to really matter at scale. And again, that's providing templates, like encouraging people to use those words and role modeling that behavior and making it easy for them to do so.
So there's this interesting theory that we try to create hierarchical structures in systems because we think that will make it easier to navigate.
Yeah.
When in fact it's like the opposite of how our brain works, where like our brain works in adjacencies, where like it's a flat graph, right? It's a flat graph, and then there's like these nodes of ideas.
It's much more networked.
Right, and exactly. Yeah, exactly. And then you either have weak or strong connections to those concepts because there's like a lot, and like this manifests in note-taking applications, most recently through stuff like backlinks. So what are your thoughts on linking these documents together, and how do you facilitate that so that, I realize I'm asking sort of like a compound question, but like, I think the important thing that I'm trying to get at is like, oftentimes you don't know what you need, but you're searching for it anyway. And it's like, how do you facilitate getting the right, how do you create serendipity?
Like the Amazon suggestions for yourself of what you're looking for.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I think there's two things. So one thing that we do in like a lot of our project docs is just a section of like related docs. And because your brain is the best at figuring out what those adjacent things are, more so than Google or like it being in the same folder, that's really helpful. And I often think about setting up the first page or first half a page for your doc as if the person has no idea what you're talking about. Because 6 months from now, you are going to have no idea what you are talking about in that doc. And so if you can set up like, hey, here's 3 sentences of context of why we're talking about this. Here was the goal. Here were the related docs. Like, here was the decision that was made at the end of it. Like, that's really helpful for someone coming back and dropping themselves into that context and connecting to those related documents or related projects. So one of our kind of upcoming product features is around like, how do you pull context in? Like, you had a meeting about this, you had a document, you had a project in Jira. All of those things are related context, and pulling them together in one place is actually what you want when you're trying to get dialed up on what's going on.
Cool. What are you, snap your fingers.
Yeah.
And the, how sort of people think about work, how people think about collaboration and culture just changes, and it morphs into or evolves into the thing that you would just love to see in the world, like manifest in the world. What is that? What does that look like? And if it already exists, like, who is the closest analog?
Interesting. I think probably the thing I would actually snap my fingers on is growth mindset or deliberately developmental. So there's a book, I think his name is Keegan, Deliberately Developmental Organizations. And it's the idea of like your whole organization has a growth mindset. And I think that to me is like the foundation, because we don't know all the changes that are going to come. We don't know if there will be a different pandemic or different things that come up that we have to deal with and what is needed from that. But having the skill that we can all say like, okay, we know that we are capable of changing how we work, because we know we're capable of learning lots of different skills related to product and marketing and different things, but we often think that like how we work is fixed. And so I think changing that belief, and I think a lot of really great HR leaders do that really effectively. Like, they think about changing their company and changing an organizational change through that lens. But in many ways, organizational change has been limited as a discipline to companies the size of like Pepsi and GE. And I would love it to be much more prevalent throughout other companies of all sorts of different sizes, so people have that knowledge that they have the ability to change that.
Yeah, there's this interesting argument that values should be fixed and culture is admittedly always changing.
Yeah.
Meaning that like your goal should be to find folks that fit your values, but are cultural additions, because every new person is going to affect in some percentage, relative percentage, the culture in a space.
We actually experimented.
It's really hard though.
I was going to say that
we
experimented this year with everyone sets like goals for OKRs, right? So we set like temporary operating principles. So like 3 things that were stuff we wanted to lean into right now. And those things we don't necessarily always want to lean into. One was prioritizing time to value. So particularly for what we're doing right now, like getting things out the door and seeing and learning from them is super important. Now, there may be other times in our stage or later in our company growth where like getting things right is way more important because like of the consequences or things like that. But for right now, speed of learning is really important. Another one was limit work in progress. So we're a small team. So like having 40 projects going is really distracting and hard. And so like finishing things. And we actually
wait. Can we pause on that? That feels like something that everybody should adopt. Like generally is like limiting work in progress seems like another way of saying focus. Seems like it makes a lot of sense.
And I think what we started to do is like we reflect on it in our retros every other week. We ask about it in other moments for the team, and it prompts people to think about like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have been like trying to push like these 4 projects forward the last 2 weeks. I should have just gotten that one closed out. And so then the next few weeks they focus on that more. And it's helped kind of really inoculate the team in terms of those principles. And, I think when we hit the 6-month mark in the year, potentially next year, we may shift those. We may say like, okay, different principles matter now.
Right.
And that, to your point, is like culture being alive and changing based on what the company is focused on right now.
I think an important thing that you're hitting on is acknowledging when you're running an experiment and that the experiment needs to have an end date.
Yeah.
Um, like we run into that,
Measurements.
and
Like, is it
and
working?
measurements. Yeah, is it working? Is it not working? Did we abandon it or get rid of it? I mean, like I've even gotten feedback, like of late that, hey, that thing that we started, did we stop it or is it still
Yeah. Yeah.
around?
Yeah.
And like you lose track of the things, the experiments you spun up, and it's not intentional, but like,
Yeah. It's just, oh, that's still going. Did we
right,
decide whether it was still a good idea? Because initially we're like, well, we could try it.
right, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I think within HR and operations and like the async transition, that's what I mean when I say like work like a product dev team. Like, don't feel like it has to be polished. Like, send someone a Google Doc template that you wrote up in 20 minutes for a meeting and see how it goes. Like, if they're afterwards, they're like, oh, I wish it had this. Cool, add that. Or sometimes they take it and they add it themselves, and it's great.
There's this other thread that I'm kind of curious about around, like there are organizations that spend a lot of time on themselves.
Mhm.
There are organizations that, um, talk a lot about, what does it mean to be us and how do we think about us and what do we
Mhm.
value and what do we, when at the end of the day, there is a job to be done, right? There's like a business to be built. And so I'm curious, like, do you feel that the world, and it's a spectrum, right? Like all good things have a dark side, right? Like
Yeah.
too much navel gazing, too much self-analysis and it's navel gazing, too much,
Yeah.
not enough self-analysis and you're not self-aware. So I guess I'm curious, like, do you think that the world is just so far at the beginning of even asking itself these basic questions about how to do work that we just need to lean
Yeah.
into it and just like embrace the self-assessment stuff? Or do you think that like there's a breaking point? We're sort of at a point where like some organizations might be spending too much time talking about stuff. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think like Range is very lucky in that like a lot of the work that we do on our company benefits our product. So we
Sure, of
rarely have to
course.
like make the decision. It's like cool. Um, but
Yeah.
I think there are like, I think about it probably more company specific. Like, there are different stages in companies based on what either is like what's most urgent for the company. And I think like the three horizons planning model is really helpful. I think this Microsoft is the one that popularized that, but it's like, your first horizon is whatever is making your business successful today. Second horizon is that next product area you're about to invest in. And third horizon is still very much in research. And you're like, I don't quite know what's going to happen. And I think we could apply that same lens to how the company is operating, right? Like, your first horizon might be, we don't have a lot of bandwidth to focus on how we're operating because we're in survival mode. And that's like an
Right.
okay thing to say. And it's actually really good to say that to your team, because then they're aware of it, they can acknowledge that. And then you can say second horizon is like, we've got some urgent stuff that we know we need to fix. Like, folks are asking about remote and we don't know yet our policy. Like, cool, we know we need to do that, but we have to fix this other thing first. Or we know we need to have a better performance management system, et cetera. Third horizon might be like, cool, we want to launch a training for how managers can work better remote. But that is just like a little bit further out for us. Now, some companies also might say like, cool, third horizon for us is focusing less on how we work. Like,
Yeah.
cool, like we've been investing on that a lot. So like third
Yeah.
horizon is like, we're in a good steady state maintenance and like doing small things.
Mm.
Now, what's cool is that a lot of the large companies that might get accused more of navel gazing is I think they've actually managed to transition to where their horizons for the company success and their horizons for team success are now one thing, where they are actually benefiting as a brand from talking about and investing in that. Like, GitLab is a great example where a lot of their content now reinforces that they're a wonderful place to work for remote, and now is doing them dividends for like the remote and hybrid work world. So that's, I think, the ideal is like those start to overlap, but it's okay to say like, cool, a year from now we want to not be working on this as much. Like, that's an okay outcome, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Well, Jen, it's been awesome to spend some time with you, twice now. I really appreciate you hanging out with us. Um,
Excited to be here.
to everybody who stuck around, thank you so much. Jen, if they want to learn more about Range, best place to go or get connected with you?
Yeah, so website is just www.range.co. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter. I'm at Upstart Girl. I'm admittedly bad at Twitter, so if I take a full day to respond, I apologize. But you're also welcome to send me an email, Jen at range.co, with a specific conversation about your team or your company, and happy to hop on and have a remote coffee and chat through what you're working on.
Cool. Have an awesome, it's Thursday. Have a great Thursday, everybody. And Jen, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's great being here.
See you.